Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast today, how LSPs are maximizing efficiency and service while reducing detention and demurrage fees. My name is Eric Johnson. I am a senior technology editor at the Journal of Commerce. Really delighted to be leading the discussion today. We have three fantastic panelists who are going to join us to talk about the role that technology can play in kind of the subject matter today. I have lots of questions for our panelists today. I have some thoughts of my own, but maybe we can get started by going around the horn and introducing our three panelists. So we have Jim McCullen, CIO of Century Supply Chain Solutions, Grant Cernick, Director of Sales at Third Wave, and Kyle Henderson, CEO of VIZION. Jim, do you want to give us a little background on yourself real quick?
Sure, thanks, Eric. Jim McCullen, Chief Information Officer at Century Supply Chain Solutions. Spent my entire career in logistics and at Century for the most part. Century's a global logistics service provider focused on origin cargo management and PO management.
Great. Grant, give us a little background on yourself and Third Wave.
Sure. So Third Wave is a software platform focused for the small and mid-size importer exporter, helping them manage their international transportation and trade compliance.
Fantastic. And Kyle.
Yeah, Kyle Henderson, CEO VIZION. I've built a career in creating products around mapping and analytics and taking them to market. And VIZION, we focus on visibility of containerized freight globally. We track all the containers in the world, provided as data.
Great. The three of you could not be more in my sweet spot for the areas that I cover at the Journal of Commerce, as you all know, and hopefully the audience does as well. So really excited. Just as a bit of context for the discussion, I can't recall in my 20-year career there ever being so much focus on both the role that visibility can play in global supply chains, and not only what role it plays, but who is the ultimate provider or who should be the provider of that data, whether it's a 3PL, the carrier, whether it's something that a shipper needs to build capability of itself. There's lots of different paths. No one is necessarily right for every single individual organization. And second, detention demurrage. There's absolutely never been such a focus as there's been in recent months, partially due to legislation that was passed in the US specifying that invoicing around detention demurrage fees needed to be accurate. It needed to have a certain number of data elements, some of which are very contingent upon where the container is, aka visibility. And also some really hefty bills that shippers and 3PLs have been getting, sometimes months after the fact when it comes to detention demurrage fees. So a super relevant topic, and really excited to dig into this, especially the role that technology and LSPs play in this. So I'm going to throw this out there. What, from an LSP perspective, can you talk about the challenge side of this issue, right? Like, what are you challenged with in terms of both attaining the visibility you need and providing it to your shipper customers in order to, sort of predict when they might be running into D&D, accurately depict when they are liable for those charges, and talk us through some of those challenges you see.
Sure, Eric. I think the biggest challenge is getting all of the information and being able to trust the data that you're getting. And there's myriad sources out there today to get that information from. And ideally, it should just be pretty straightforward, right? Like, this is where your container is, this is where it's going to be, and this is when you can get it. And that's what our customers expect, from Century's perspective, from our VIZIV platform, and being able to present that data. But there's a massive amount of work that has to go in today to get that information. And so, you've got so many variables because you've got so many different owners of the data, in essence, right? So you've got the ocean carriers, and they're responsible for segments of that information. But then when the container gets into the terminal, the ocean carriers have some of that data, but not all of it. And so, companies like VIZION have that ability to then bring in the full picture so that we can see it and understand it. So I I think the first challenge is just knowing where the containers are before getting to the stage of where they're going to be. And, we've gotten so much better as an industry in at least having many, many sources of that data, but somebody's got to still cleanse it and figure it out. So we do a lot of that at Century. We take in all of those different sources and cleanse it and decide what we want to trust and present to the end customer. But, in a perfect world, there'd just be a single source of information that you could trust consistently.
Not necessarily a realistic
No.
part of it. I agree. I mean, I think everyone would love to snap their fingers and have a single source, but the reality is, you said, is we're in a really kind of fragmented world. I mean, even if you take one container port cluster, say Southern California, we're dealing with 12 individual terminals, a bunch of different terminal providers, 2 different port authorities, some shipping line affiliated, others independent, some with data portals talking about their visibility, milestones that are presented, but then that means shippers have to go or 3PLs have to go and individually go to some of those portals. So,
Eric,
really,
yeah, just on that thought too, that's a great example, right? Long Beach, 11 plus terminals, and our teams used to have to go to each one of those terminals to make appointments to drop off empty containers, pick up loaded containers, and so we ended up having to write RPA bots to do that process. But again, every one of them is a different process, and so yeah, it is extremely painful to be able to move around the information and the containers themselves at times.
Just real quickly, Jim, before I move on, can you kind of generalize? I know you have a lot of different customers with a lot of different needs, but can you generalize sort of what they're expecting from you around that type of visibility? Like, is there a baseline that they are all expecting, a single repository for that data, or how does that work?
Yeah, they want it 100% of the time, 100% accurate, right? And it's extremely challenging. It's like I was at the Flow, the White House Flow Initiative last week in D.C., and Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg was trying to compare container tracking to airlines, and the fact that, could you imagine if you were waiting to pick someone up and you looked at one app and you got one date, and you looked at another app and you got another date, and then turns out the person was actually arriving at a different airport than what you thought they were. That's what we deal with every day, and it's really trying to figure out, what do we want to trust, what's accurate, so that we can give that trusted information to our customers. And so yeah, it's and it makes perfect sense, right? Like, you want to know where your container is and when it's going to be available for pickup, and it should be pretty straightforward, but it's not.
Yeah, at least you didn't make the Domino's pizza comparison. I'm tracking. So good for Secretary Pete. Kyle, I think if there's one universal thing that's been that I've seen over the different cycles of following the visibility market, it's that handoffs from carrier to terminal and then terminal visibility itself has been this chronic pain point, whether it's an LSP or their customer that they have to convey that data to. What makes that so difficult? What's the challenge there?
Well, part of what, whether fairly or unfairly, characterizes the terminal as kind of the black hole is, just so many different parties involved. The ocean carrier themselves, works a little bit like an aggregator. Often the data that they might provide you in their portals and such, they've been able to pull from their parties and their reporting network and such. But the information coming directly from the terminal, one, there's a variety of terminal operating systems. There's not necessarily standards there. Some, not such like LA and Long Beach, but there are some terminals in the world that are relatively manually run still. You look down in South America, et cetera. But systems just haven't necessarily been a priority there in terms of making information and data available. And honestly, like the pressure wasn't there until we really started seeing a supply chain crunch as well. You go back 5 years or so, ocean freight was thought of as, well, I'll book it and it'll be here in 4 to 6 weeks, and when someone tells me it's here, I'll go pick it up, type of thing. But with the crunch and really sizable demurrage fees accumulating, the pressure changed quite a bit on wanting to be able to get access to information. And no, honestly, the network, the operators, the investment was not there yet to make it easy to access. So there's been a lot of scrambling the last few years, but we've seen some of that start to change, and we're seeing, whether it was port community getting set up, whether it was terminal operators starting to bring APIs online, et cetera, we're seeing progress made over there. But if you look back, and even not too far back in history, it's been a challenging space to get kind of any connectivity into.
Yeah, I mean, from my vantage point, I sort of have seen terminals view their their portals as somewhat of a point of differentiation. They're competing for business. They're competing for importer business via their shipping line customers. They're competing for services, the shipping lines. So it will be interesting as we transition to a place where they're a little bit more, and it sounds like they are a little bit more open to kind of APIs, not everyone congregating in their portal necessarily, but the data flowing to portals that are a little bit more common. What, if I can drill this down, are there specific data elements within the terminal that are especially important for Vision customers and that are, again, on the challenging side, a little bit more challenging to get at? Or is it kind of a universal across the board? Milestones within the terminal are just in general difficult to access?
There are specific milestones and statuses that are more consistently available directly from the terminal operator or the terminal operating system that are not necessarily as available from the ocean carrier, just in today's world, the kind of status quo situation. Now, you'd expect to see things like vessel arrive, discharge from vessel, gate ins, gate outs, ideally something like available for pickup, and even, the empty return. But the reality is, depending on the carriers for all those events, you're going to get inconsistencies. Some carriers will be better than others, and that can even be better than others in certain geographies or certain ports. But with the terminal operators, the terminal operating systems, the kind of most desired events and statuses today are: is it available for pickup? When is the last free day, the free time storage? Are there any holds currently on the box? And have any fees or fines started to get incurred? And how much are those? Now, I haven't seen any terminal yet do that job perfectly, but I've seen a lot of progress, especially when it comes into understanding fees and fines and how this accumulated, and even questions around last free day for whom. There's last free day from the perspective of utilizing and dealing with the terms of the terminal, but there's also the contract between the booking party and perhaps the carrier as well.
Yeah.
Some things have been negotiated. So there's challenges there, but those generally are the high demand events and statuses: last free day, available for pickup, holds, fees, and fines.
Yeah. That last bit you brought is a perfect example of you can have great data and still have conflicts arise, right? Like what the terminal considers its last free day and what the carrier and shipping or carrier and shipper have contracted for might differ, and both pieces of data are correct, and you have to sort of figure out which supersedes the other. Okay, Grant. So your platform and you, I know we've talked a lot. You're catering toward the BCO. Now, part of that, I would imagine, involves having a platform where you can kind of manage your vendors, aka 3PLs, on the platform itself, right? So I've yet to meet a shipper who does everything themselves. So How do you sort of big picture view the importance of visibility, especially as it transitions from the carrier into the terminal? What are some of the challenges you see?
Yeah. So firstly, great to be here. And, I want to jump into the screen and hug Kyle. That is his last statement on the difference between what basically what the House Bill of Lading, which represents the relationship between the shipper and the forwarder, and the Master Bill of Lading, which represents the relationship between the forwarder and the carrier, can say very different things. And this almost doesn't get talked about at all in the supply chain realm. And I think that a lot of the confusion that exists is really related to this one point where it's easy to say I'd like a ETA of a vessel at a certain port. The meaning of what that ETA is as it relates to a term known as demurrage, which everybody thinks they understand and is a common term. Well, that demurrage date and the amount of free time that a shipper has is not necessarily related to the amount of free time that a forwarder has in the port as they negotiated with their carriers. And so you get into confusion when you get something like a last free day message from a terminal, because that last free day, if you are a shipper, does not necessarily apply to you. And you don't necessarily know that because of the confusion, right? So everything that I believe that everything that Jim and Kyle have said is totally true as it relates to all the problems that we face today. Now, compound that by the fact that shippers in particular don't understand necessarily the complexity of the relationships and what those data points mean as it relates to their context, creates a whole bunch of confusion and an issue, because it isn't necessarily that the dates and data are wrong. It's that they're wrong for the context or use. And that's a different problem, right? That's an understanding problem of what it means. And so we need to be able to dissect the problems that are related to data and data quality and context quality. And effectively, that's what Third Wave, ultimately helps our customers do. And so I'm not sure I totally addressed exactly what your initial question is, largely because I can't remember in particular, but I do believe that as it relates to the overall challenges that shippers are facing as it relates to them dealing with their forwarders and the carriers and the terminals and all of the other players, is one of a lack of sort of supply chain understanding of what the relationships are and what the data actually means as it relates to a context.
So I'm going to jump in because I think what you just said about anyone who's listened to me has probably heard me say the word context or contextualize more than anything else I ever say, which probably makes me a really boring person at dinner parties. But I'll give an analogy. If my son on a blank piece of paper misspells a word so badly that I can't even understand what he was trying to say, I have no way to figure out what that is, right? If he writes it in a sentence and that same word, I can figure out what that word means within the context of the sentence. And I think that's sort of a very simplistic way to think about the environment that visibility data exists in. If we hope for 100% accuracy across the board without context, we're going to be waiting until a very long time. But if we have contextual clues to put that data, even if it's not perfect, then that's a whole different picture, right? And I think that's very relevant to a space like terminals, where we don't have the same type of direct feeds that we've had with maybe shipping lines and in other modes, right? So can we I want to put kind of a finer point on the challenges before we move on to like where this is going and kind of solutions to this. Can we maybe give a few examples of where this lack of quality data and the lack of context around it turns into inefficiencies, like maybe some actual examples? Grant and Jim, I'm sure you have direct customer tales you can tell of people calling you and complaining about this and that. But I mean, anything spring to mind?
I'll jump in just on one quick one, which is the vessel schedule and ETA information, right? And so you can get still today, even if you're buying it from a third party or getting it directly, you could have this 3 different carriers on the same vessel, and you could have 3 different ETAs right from plan, right? And then as you start to get updates from these carriers, they can all be different, right? And so then you go over to the port side and you get the planned vessel arrival from the port, and that could differ from what the carriers are saying. So it becomes this challenge of who do you trust? When do you trust them? And Kyle and his team have been doing a lot of work as well. As Century, we've been doing that too, really trying to figure out who do you want to trust in each of these scenarios. And as Kyle mentioned earlier, it could vary by port and terminal. It could vary by carrier. So all of those things come into it. So yeah, that's one I would throw out there.
Why? Just to double down on that, Grant. I know you want to jump in, but just to double down on that example, why is that the case that the same sailing has 3 totally different streams of information? What's the root cause of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the plan side, it's just the systems that each of those carriers are using, and maybe they're not getting updated the same way. So you might have, maybe it's the vessel owner might have better information in some cases, and maybe that just doesn't get cycled down to those other carriers at times. Then you also bring NVOs into the mix who are providing vessel schedules as well. And so yeah, I just think there's too many people touching the information. And it depends on how they're updating the ETAs as well. Are they updating it just, on, things like vessel speed or previous history? And again, I think that can vary. If somebody's really using AI to help figure out that timing in the vessel, that's going to be different than somebody who's just doing it based on vessel speed. So yeah, I think it's just a lack of consistency in how it's calculated.
Interesting. Grant, I'm sure you have something.
Yeah. So I mean, I agree with Jim. Everything that he said there, and as we get into and maybe Kyle can touch on this a little bit about the estimation of when vessels will arrive or containers will arrive or things like that. As you have more LSPs delving into the estimation realm, those estimates are going to vary wildly, and that's going to compound the problem, not make it better. From our perspective, representing the shipper, the issue tends, and also just one small note that we really do focus on sort of the mid-size and small to mid-size companies. Those companies tend not to need sort of incredibly accurate or sort of precise is probably a better word. Arrival times, where if somebody said a vessel is arriving at 2 p.m. and somebody else said it's going to be at 3 p.m. and a different person said it's going to be at 6 p.m. or a different provider says it's 6 p.m. Yeah, okay, that creates a confusion insofar as what time is it going to get there. But practically speaking, our customers tend not to particularly care when a vessel is arriving. They do care when a container will be available. But the point as a result of that ultimately is that as you don't really need to know or have the precision. What you really need is a context to understand sort of what is the general expectation, and then you need a source to update that context, right? So if you don't have your own personal context or your own corporate context, then your outcome is going to be, I need to go to Kuehne+Nagel to get an update. I need to go to DB Schenker to get an update. I need to go to Expediter to get an update. And if you happen to be in a situation where those three forwarders have containers on the same vessel, you will get three different answers to the question, and that creates a problem. For us, we don't actually have that problem because, well, we use Vision as our sole source of updating. And yes, we know that that customer will have three containers on three different vessels, but because we're only going to Vision to get the update, I don't particularly care what Kuehne+Nagel has to say or DB Schenker has to say about the arrival of that vessel. What I care about is what Vision has reported as when the estimated arrival time will be, so I can update the context such that the knock-on processes matter. And so the idea, as Jim was saying, that you could have three different dates is a problem that just goes away by virtue of the fact that I don't have to deal with those. I just have one source of data. And is it the most, is Vision the most precise? I'll let Kyle answer that question, and maybe they are, and maybe they're not. I don't know. But whether they're half an hour off or an hour off or 4 hours off or, even in some instances, 8 hours off, that is totally immaterial to my customers, right? They just need to have some level of consistency and knowing what it is so that they can order their drayage and deliveries can be scheduled and so on and so forth. And once you get confidence and consistency, okay, fine. Yes, I would like 4 hours. 4 hours, off is better than 8 hours off, and 2 hours is better than 4 hours. But you're going to get marginal benefit there. Now, again, if you're a JIT just in time and you have a 2 hour window that you got to hit a dock, okay, it's a little bit of a different story, and precision then becomes more important. But you're really dealing in the rarefied air of the Fortune 500 with those problems, and most companies don't really have those problems.
Yeah.
If I could just add on to that too, it's a great point, right? Like same thing with the data that we're getting from Vision. You have a single point of trusted information. The challenge is getting everybody to agree to that so that they don't go out looking at K&N site or this other site, because that is a challenge, right? You'll have somebody in an office somewhere, well, I'm seeing this data, it's not the same. You have to trust one source of data, right? And
well, and that's a great point. So like our customers, like once you have the confidence, once you realize that it doesn't really matter, then you don't care. And part of the challenge is that most companies don't have a corporate context, right? A system that they're using that's able to just, ping Vision or Vision pings them and get updated, and it just happens. And so that's the problem, right? That's where your problem lies. And if you solve that problem, then all of a sudden you get rid of the three different, forwarders with three different dates. And so then you get to, well, wait a second, consistency of data is not the problem, or accuracy of data is not the problem. It really is confidence in your system at your shipper site.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a totally different problem than more accurate data.
Yeah.
Kyle, okay, I want to bring you in because I think this is sort of an interesting thread in that the data in and of itself is interesting, but not useful or valuable until it's, sort of used within the context of another system, right? So how do you, does that influence the way that you think about kind of gathering the data and producing it for customers, whether it's an LSP, another software vendor, or a shipper? I assume you cater to all three. How do you think about that? Like, because there's definitely providers on the market who want to be the portal that everyone goes to, but how should they be thinking about this?
Yeah, there's a lot of consideration in how we process and structure the data, and then even make the API, the technical interface for retrieving the data, and how we even have designed the schema of the data for what gets sent. And those considerations are weighed when understanding the end use cases inside the solutions such as Third Wave. visive, etc. Because you could structure the data one way and you could design the API endpoints one way that actually make it very challenging to create a even basic feature. Say like you want to do an exception notification, or you want to be able to even identify and share information like the IMO of the vessel, for example. Just in how you've designed the data structure and how you access it, you can make it easier or more difficult. It's almost the technical user experience of the API and data schema. So, from our perspective, we've put a lot of time and effort into making sure that our API design and our data schema design supports like common track and trace use cases, supports, easily being able to put a map together, easily being able to pull information to understand, is this an actual or is this an estimate in some way, shape, or form? And so you do design the data and how you format it for its end purposes. And we, it's very interesting here at Vision because we have a team of wonderful product managers, designers, software engineers, and a lot of the team had come from building applications and solutions in the past, but we don't build that here. But it's extremely meaningful because we very much understand what makes something too much of a pain to want to have to deal with when you make bad design decisions in terms of data and APIs. So I think that the answer, Eric, is a lot of thought goes into it to make data easy to use for the use case.
Hey, Kyle, I'll just chime on that one point there too. Because you're just focused on the data, you're focused on the the collection, classification and delivery of the data, it has to be good, right? Whereas if you're also delivering it as a platform, you can cover up some of those things in the platform. You can't cover it up in your data.
Fudge there.
Exactly.
Well, Jim, let's dig in. I mean, we're talking today about the role of visibility in kind of especially managing ancillary fees from a forwarder NVO perspective. How does, forget about what your customers directly want, on an internal basis. I know it's hard to do that, right? You have to think of everything through your customer lens, but from an internal operating basis, what is the value of visibility and how does that maybe translate into efficiency and cost, right? Like what specifically is visibility doing to help you manage operating costs so you can increase margin, essentially?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so on our Sentry domestic, our domestic division, and we have a domestic control tower service offering for customers as well. That was in the past a very, very manual effort of exactly what we were talking about earlier. Grant was talking about, right? Of people going out and chasing to figure out, okay, what containers are available for me to pick up today to bring to the transload facility to transload into domestic trailers. Now, with the data that we get from Vision, we can see that in real time. And so our domestic control tower team is operating from data instead of having to go and chase that information to figure out what they do next. So absolutely a savings there. At origin as well, having better visibility to what's happening, at the ports helps our operations teams if they need to divert freight that's going into a port because of some constraint that's happening. They can do that. They've got that visibility through the port statistics division, and then just the tracking data as well. We used to have a team, a dedicated team that would go out and manually chase. It was 12 people that would manually chase all the events that we weren't getting from NVOs and other players. That team is now doing something else because we can get that data electronically. So yeah, from an LSP perspective, it's a huge savings from a resource, just like our customers, right? Being able to see and feel exactly what's happening each step of the way. And then it does certainly extend out to our customers from there.
Do you think about where the value of where that comes from an internal versus a customer facing perspective? Like, how would you break down? Do you even think of it that way in terms of like we accrue 70% of the value from an operational perspective and 30% from a this brings in new customers or it expands our relationship with existing customers? How do you sort of break that down?
Yeah, so it's, number one, we're always looking at it from a productivity standpoint, right? How do we continue to scale and grow the company without just adding more bodies, right? More people to that process. Plus, in most cases, people aren't really interested in doing that mundane work. Like, hey, here's 150 containers, go track them on these sites. They don't want to do that anymore. It's the same thing with like, here, go to this terminal site and book these containers, book these appointments for containers. Like, I don't want to do that work. And so that's a big part of this is being able to align, increase that productivity to make sure that our people are working on the stuff that adds the most value to the company and to our customers. So we certainly look at it from that aspect of it. And then, the logistics, the LSP market is unbelievably competitive. Right. And so customers are asking us to do more and more every day for the same price, basically. And so we've got to find ways to constantly be more efficient. And this is one of those ways.
It's interesting that you bring up the competitive nature of the market. I was actually just talking earlier today with someone who I had done work with about 10 years ago about the ocean freight market. And I said, looking back now, there was all this investment into the market. And it was supposed to, theoretically get rid of 3PLs. There's probably more 3PLs now than there were 10 years ago, right? So it's incredibly competitive, and the investment has actually fueled that competitiveness. I don't think it's tamped it down at all. Grant, how do you, do you view this data as sort of more of an something that empowers your customers to be more operationally effective, or is this kind of like a DIY self-service type of tool for you? How do you sort of visualize the usage of it?
It's a great question, and sort of plays into the question of like, the question you just asked around forwarders and 10 years ago, will forwarders go away? Like, there's zero chance forwarders are going anywhere, and it makes total sense that there are more of them. The idea that a shipper is going to arrange drayage overseas and then negotiate with carriers to get something on, and then deal with their drayage on this side and a deconsolidation facility, and so like there is so much complexity there. Like we're talking about dates and estimated times of arrival, and we haven't solved that problem yet. And the idea that somehow shippers are going to magically be able to deal with all of the complexity immediately is like kind of laughable.
Yep.
But the thing, one of the things that Jim mentioned, which I think sort of deserves sort of like a little revisit, is the idea of when a shipment, like there are two different kinds of problems that can arise. One is that like that there was an estimate and the vessel is delayed against that estimate. So that a vessel or a container is supposed to arrive at a certain place on a certain date at a certain time, or whatever that looks like. And then because of an update, you now know that thing that was supposed to happen, it did happen, didn't happen, will not happen, is going to be delayed, or things around that. There's a totally different class of problem that exists, which is when something is not knowing that something is supposed to happen, and then that thing, like anything that happens on those instances where you don't know that something's supposed to happen, you just don't know that there's a problem. So as an example, you have a container that is to get on a particular vessel to then arrive on a certain date so that you can then process inward. If you don't understand systematically that a container is to be on a very particular vessel on a certain date, so you're expecting a loaded on board message or something of the like, right? If you don't know that you are to expect that, then you don't know that you're going to miss when that happens. So if a container gets rolled, then all that's going to happen is you're not going to get a message, and you're not now going to know that a container's been rolled, and now you're going to expect it a week later, a week delayed. So this idea that there's a whole set of expectation that you have as a shipper For most companies, they don't have that. Now, when you don't have that, it now means that every point that is of import to you, the transportation professional, becomes an important point that has to be managed manually, which now means that you got to go source that data because you can't possibly get it automatically to achieve a problem to know when a container gets rolled, for instance, right? And so this idea, like, I keep on coming back to this idea that shippers need their own context from a transportation management perspective, because most of the problems, or a great number of the problems that exist that they complain about, are these ideas that they systematically don't know something was supposed to happen. So when it doesn't happen, or it's different than what they were expecting, they know about it proactively and can now deal with it, right? And so all of the things, as you know, to just get back to the question you asked, all of the things that we manage do make it more self-serve and more proactive. But that doesn't mean the forwarders are not doing their job, and the carriers are not doing their job, and the ports are not doing their job. Everybody's still doing their job. Now the business just has more information to make decisions, change things, and be able to interact with their service providers in a more functional way, such that if a container gets rolled, well, you don't need to wait another week for that Maersk vessel to come, or for Maersk to bring it around. Maybe your forwarder is able to get it on an MSC vessel that's leaving tomorrow. But the only way you can know that is if you knew that it got rolled, and you had to know that it was supposed to get on a vessel to know that it got rolled. Does that answer that question?
Really interesting thread you pulled out there, Grant. I hope everyone kind of followed where you're going with that, because that was really crucial.
And Grant, we use that data every day. You know, operationally, our teams around the world are looking at, you know, when a vessel's going through a transship port, for example, did it actually load on the intended vessel or not? And so then they are exactly what you said, right? Our teams across the world are then engaging with that carrier to find out, what are you doing about this container, letting the customer know. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thanks.
So I have one more kind of line of questioning that I wanted to get at really briefly, because we have a whole bunch of really great questions that have come in from the audience that I want to sort of take the last quarter of the hour or so to address as many of those as we can. But I think there is a question that's hanging out there around data quality, right? And Jim, I think you specifically mentioned, right, the need for quality data and data accuracy. And I want to sort of play devil's advocate and say, are we overly focused on the data accuracy aspect of this picture? So in other words, going back to my very crude analogy about, if I have some context around it, I don't need the word to be absolutely perfect, but I need it to be in the right place, and I need to have a system to contextualize it. So is there too much of a focus on 100% perfect data, when the reality is that we've been kind of managing for years and years and years without that, and it really only surfaced during this exceptional period of time? And Kyle, I'll let you chime in on this, because obviously you're in the business of providing perfect data, but I also want to hear from Jim and Grant on this. So Kyle, maybe kick us off.
So the important thing to keep your eye on is that there is a required amount of data, and that's as a required accuracy of data, required completeness of data, required latency of data for whatever operational use case you're trying to execute. And some of those use cases are more sophisticated than others. That can depend on like the sophistication or complexity of the end cargo owner's overall supply chain, or the size of the freight forwarder, et cetera. So what you're trying to accomplish as a business has requirements of the data quality. And this is a conversation that my team and our partners and other companies in our space frequently have, because you need to understand what someone wants to accomplish with this data, because the data by itself is not the solution. The data is just the fuel that goes into an engine, and together those become the solution. So you need something like a VIZION, you need something like a third wave to fully unlock the value of data access and the data quality, and you have to connect it with those use cases. Now, in our space, data quality can be understood by those key elements of completeness and accuracy and latency. Now, completeness is an interesting thing to go through because, depending on your business, you might just need to know, did vessel arrive and is it available for pickup? You might know the sophistication of your business only requires that. But you might need to actually know 30 or 40 other events with a certain amount of completeness across all of your shipments. And your certain level of completeness might be like, I don't need to get it 100% of the time. I need to get it 90% of the time. And another element of that could be like, well, whenever I get the vessel arrive event, I need the completeness of the UN low code for that location arrived to always be filled in. What's also interesting about that, though, is that's just saying, was data sent? The accuracy, meaning does it represent reality, is another interesting element too. I bring up UN low codes because one of the challenging things in this space is there are multiple UN low codes for some locations. UN low codes can be difficult to match when you're not initially provided a UN low code from the source, if you're just given like a human readable name for a location. And there are locations being utilized in the logistics networks that don't yet have a UN low code as well. So it's accurate and complete to not include it because it doesn't actually exist in reality. So there are many, many layers, and it can get complex, but it all comes down to what is the end use case of the user and therefore the customer and their partners. Now, there was a comment made a moment ago about, I think Eric, you say like, is it good enough? We didn't have all of this sophistication a few years ago. Can't we just get the job done? And the reality is kind of yes, but kind of no, because the world is certainly different now than it was a few years ago. And I don't just mean like the supply chain crunch we had caused by COVID and e-commerce, et cetera. I mean, just simply like back pressure of expectations from kind of the end consumer that moves up to the retailer, that might move up to the wholesaler, which then moves up to their suppliers. And by the way, there's transportation in between all of those as well. And there's parties helping with that transportation. And as there's been more pressure to try and get the optimal amount of goods to the right location at exactly the right time, that might be like an individual unit. It might be, a purchase off of Amazon or some other e-commerce. That back pressure has been building for years now, where e-commerce and like is at such a scale that to maintain its thin margin of success in some sense, it has to have more insight and accuracy farther up the chain into containerized freight, into what's happening at manufacturers, et cetera. It's easy to imagine what the future is going to be in this space, but we're also having to take step by step and understand like the completeness of data, the accuracy of data, the latency of data. Are you getting data on time for your use cases is step one from a technical perspective to understand if you can empower the business case and the use case. Did I answer your question?
Eric, if I could just jump in on that and build on what Kyle says, like, so we have to, again, understand what the challenges are that everybody's facing, right? Kyle's in the business of providing data, right? And so the question that you asked was like, are we making too big a deal about like accurate data? I mean, listen, Kyle's business is contingent on having better data, more available data, more consistent data, more uptime. Kyle probably has a list of things that is important to his business. He is a data provider, and the better he can get at providing data, they are doing a better job, right? So on those dimensions that matter to Kyle, they matter to Kyle and VIZION. For a third wave, and perhaps for a century, and again, we do some similar things, but we address different people. My customers don't necessarily need Kyle's data or Vision's data to be better, be faster, better, more quality, whatever. Of course they would like it, but it's one data source and one data input of a whole host of different things that basically, going from 4 hours accurate to 3 hours accurate moves the needle not a lick for my customers.
Yeah.
Right. So that while that's a driver for Kyle because he has to be better, that doesn't help. And so just one quick anecdote. I was at TPM and I was we were having drinks at a bar with actually competitors of Vision. And I love those guys. They're talking to me about, what their measures on their dimensions and whatever. And they're saying, oh, we're better on this and we're better on that and whatever. And like, I mean, I have no idea. And, it's a competitive market and everybody knows what dimensions they're playing and whatever. But I had to stop and I said, guys, like, you're trying to convince me on something to switch vendors that doesn't impact me, not in the least, right? It doesn't impact me. It doesn't impact my customers. What I know is the service provider we have, which is Vision, is doing like a great job supporting the needs that I have. You're going to have to come up with some better reason than you get stuff faster or it's more accurate. Like that doesn't move my needle, right? And so when you have like the shipper BCO saying, I need better, more accurate data, I can almost guarantee you that they are trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist or that doesn't move a needle in any way, shape, or form, right? If that's their problem, they've solved all these other problems and they're concerned that my availability time in a port needs to be an hour more accurate to be more effective. Forget about the fact that demurrage and detention as of today is not a problem anymore. They're trying to solve a problem from a year and 2 years ago. Like today, if you're getting contracts, you're 10 free days, 15 free days, like you have infinity free days. I promise you the accuracy of those times do not move the needle a lick.
Interesting.
And that doesn't mean Kyle shouldn't be focusing on getting better, because it does. He needs to he always needs to be driving to better.
So we could go on this, and you just started circling back to the D&D stuff, which I agree with. Like as I mentioned, we're in this phase now where there's more scrutiny over this. Even as freight rates are coming down, there's more scrutiny around this than ever before. But I want to get to some questions that have come in. Martin said, "Wait, shipping folks at a bar having a drink? That never happens." No,
I'm a software tech guy.
No, Kyle, Martin did have another question in terms of, can we, because this is kind of carries forth on the conversation we were just having. Can you contextualize what accuracy rates are compared to actual arrival and release? I believe that's release of cargo. Like where are we? Where are you? Where is the market in terms of accuracy?
Yeah, so there's accuracies of what's reported as actual, and there's accuracies of what is estimated. I'll talk about an actual first. Like we said, this happened at this specific time, this place, etc. The wonderful thing over the last few years is we've been able to tap into multiple data sources that are all trying to report the same thing. So we were talking about vessel arrived earlier, and this has been an interesting one because if you go back a few years, like the key source was the carrier. The carrier, maybe on their track and trace website or an EDI message would say vessel arrived. Then AIS providers started to become available, and you could see where the boat was on the water, and you could get an update every 15 minutes or 5 minutes or so. And so you could go and look for yourself, had it arrived in some sense. And now that you can start connecting to port terminals more directly, they also are saying the vessel has arrived. What's been interesting is first, and what we started to realize as even more sources came on, the definition of arrived was different from different parties as well.
Sure.
It could be arrived as the carrier said, hey, it's arrived. It's, it's 100, 200 miles offshore, and it's just kind of waiting for other boats to get cleared out of the way, and then it'll come in. But the port terminal might say, it's arrived because we have it actually in our queue for being able to come in to get it to berth type of situation. And then you could also have
where it's birthed.
Where is the berth? And
Yeah.
arrive
I
could
mean,
also
it's
mean
birthed.
slightly different things too. It's like, is it at the berth, or is it within several hundred miles, or is it in the waiting area as well? And so what's been interesting with saying what is accurate, it comes down to, okay, what's the definition required for the business case, the business need? And what's also been great is things like AIS have provided IoT data. And so this has put us in an interesting position where we get to actually kind of start deciding what is accurate based upon the consistency of parties reporting in what context as well, right? So we can, for ourselves, geofencing every single port and terminal world, geofencing all of the berths, et cetera, we can define what that is, and we can actually share that definition. And we can also then say, well, we know to be looking from the carrier or the port terminal when we are seeing the vessel within certain proximity, et cetera. So accuracy in that kind of context exists for almost every single event, strangely enough. Because even if you look at something like a gate in or a gate out at a port terminal, you can have different dates and timestamps from the carrier and the port terminal as well, which we've partnered up with IoT device companies who have the device on the container itself to start building the data sets of seeing who is more consistently reporting in what situation compared to the actual, because now we have IoT devices, but we don't have IoT devices on every single container. So sometimes you have like the statistical model approach of deciding what we're going to report as accurate. And other times you have an actual device you can rely on as accurate. And sometimes we define what accurate is going to be with a clear definition that can be universally applied.
And,
So, oh, go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, Eric. Yeah, I was just going to say, and Kyle, from Vision standpoint, that's where we see the real value, right? Like Kyle and his team are out there every day thinking about what other data source can I use to try to really get this information accurate and complete. And so, that's been a big value. And one of the things too, from an LSP perspective in the past, our customers would want us to do all of these scorecards. How is this carrier doing with events, or this NVO doing with events? It really doesn't matter anymore. To Grant's point earlier, right? Like the data is here. Don't worry about how I got it. It's the most trusted information that we can provide. Use it.
Yep. Well, Jim, I wanted to come back to you because there was a comment in here about how a lot of these problems a lot of what we've discussed today are sort of echoes problems that people were trying to solve in the 80s and 90s, and certainly when I started covering the space 2000s, right? So why do we seemingly double back to these age-old problems around what data we can rely upon, and maybe let's kind of put that D&D wrapper on this. Like why specifically does it matter from a managing those ancillary fees perspective?
Yeah, so I think COVID obviously brought a lot of that into play, right? And Grant and Kyle brought it up earlier too. In the past, things just kind of worked, and so you didn't really worry about it too much, right? And then all of a sudden, everything stopped working, and everybody was looking for visibility anywhere they could find it. And so I think that's what kind of reset or restarted this. And honestly, we found as a Argent Cargo manager, all of a sudden our customers recognized how unbelievably valuable we were at all of those origin ports, because they went from managing one or two, 3 or 4 carriers and a couple of MVOs to 15 or 20 providers, right? And how do you get all that data? So I think that's what really kind of re-kicked this, and then obviously all the tech investment in the logistics space. But as we come back to the D&D side and getting product off the port into your distribution centers, it's funny. It made me think of it this week. I was driving up Route 95 and my cell phone locked up on me, and I had the directions in my cell phone, and I didn't know where I was going anymore, and I couldn't call anybody because my cell phone was locked up. And so I actually had to find somebody walking down the street and borrow their cell phone to call my wife to have her send me a password so I could get back into it. And if you think about it from the destination side, what we're asking people to do is to trust this data to make those decisions instead of having all these different groups trying to be out there finding it. So if you think about it, without this data, you've got a logistics team and an importer. They're checking sites and everything else to figure out when these containers are going to be available for pickup. And you've got a local trucker or maybe a broker. They're doing the same thing, right? So you've got all these parties doing this work. Well, if we replace that need with data so that they can trust it, well, it's got to be there all the time. So that's why it becomes more and more critical to have that data to rely on.
Yeah, I thought Kyle had an interesting point that I often have emphasized is that the industry had gotten so good and so efficient that we came to view the international transportation of containers as sort of a utility. I wouldn't even call it a commodity. It was a utility, right? You turned it on in Asia and it, you flipped the switch and it magically appeared relatively close to the time that you thought it would. And I think that is probably the lasting impact of COVID, is that we won't at least for another 5 to 10 years, we won't take it for granted in the same way. And I think that's why there's a little more lasting kind of impact on buying decisions around, data and systems to put that data into context. Maybe, yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Quick comment there. I definitely agree that a consideration around resiliency has led to visibility being a high priority. Yeah. But I'd also say that I think more impactful to visibility as a fuel for business has been, if we think about the transportation network, all the different nodes and everything, the investment in technology has not been evenly distributed. And this is one of those places where the investment has happened later. And so there's much more pressure and much more business value in being able to be more sophisticated in Ocean now, because you can get gains in the other parts of your business by being smarter here now. Before, you didn't have a lever to be able to get anything out of being better here. Now you do.
Well, and especially, again, relevant to the topic today, there was no investment being made into the drayage world. There was hardly any investment made in intermodal rail visibility, right? Because
find a good chassis.
There was no investment being made into where chassis were, and all of that has changed, right? So those sort of not peripheral, but adjacent pieces that were really long overlooked from an investment standpoint got some attention because the situation got so desperate. And now it's kind of like, wait, we didn't know where all these assets are. We didn't know where capacity was. We didn't know, the drayage providers didn't have the ability to sort of figure out where they could drop an empty. It seems kind of improbable that we ever let it get to that place, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to touch on the demurrage piece of it and detention. I mean, detention works the same way, but one of the challenges that exists from a shipper perspective as it relates to demurrage is really understanding what the parameters are around when demurrage is going to be charged. So most people don't even really understand just the parameters, right? If you have 4 free days, what does it mean, right? And certainly data will not tell you that answer, right? 4 free days means a container arrives, you have the first day free, but the clock starts, and then it starts at offload from a vessel. So there is a message which is offload from the vessel, which almost always occurs, pretty close to 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it ends at the outgate message from the terminal. Okay, so there's a calculation that has to be done between the offload and the outgate to be able to understand how many days you dwelled in the terminal, and then you have to compare that to the contractual figure that was the number of free days to determine if there was a charge, and if there was a charge, how much. Okay, now that's a lot of information to digest, to figure it out, and VIZION on its own is not going to give you the answer. Okay, it will give you 2 data points. It'll give you the offload time, and it'll give you the outgate time. But if you are a shipper that is concerned about demurrage, I'm sorry to say VIZION does not solve your problem. Okay, they are inputs to your problem, but they are just as much an input as your contract is, and understanding your contract systematically and understanding.
Oh. Grant?
And how.
Yeah,
I did not
think
mute
we're
him.
losing Grant.
Yeah. Grant, you're on mute.
I think your earbuds may have died.
Ah, that's probably it. There you go. Well, we are past time, and we've gone into overtime. It's playoff hockey time, Grant, for you. So I thought we'd go. We go into sudden death here. Maybe a final closing thought, because I think everyone, as awesome as this conversation is, we probably all have day jobs to get back to at some point. So, Jim, any closing thought?
No, I think things are getting better with sources like VIZION today. I think to Grant's point as well, like you need the technology, from Century's side, you need the people there to help you be able to orchestrate and use that data, as Grant said, right? Like, you've got, it's just data at that point. You still need to then use it to make decisions with. And so, we're headed in the right direction.
Grant, do you want to say what you got muted on, so that everyone? So that was the key point, right, for the whole hour. So
well, it could be. To be honest, I don't know exactly what exactly where I left off. But what I was going to say is the starting point and the end point are two data points. The contract is another data point, and unless you can systematically understand all this stuff to understand how your system is working and all the containers that you are managing, because it's not one container. The problem is not if you're moving one container.
Totally.
It's if you're moving hundreds of containers at a time. How do I know what the problem is? And again, going back to demurrage and whatever, if you think that this problem is a data quality thing, let's say you had the best data and were able to understand exactly which container you had in demurrage at the port, whatever, at Long Beach during COVID. That also didn't matter because you couldn't get a slot to go pick up the container. So this is not a data quality problem, at least from a shipper perspective. Again, Jim is going to have a different perspective on LSPs. LSPs fulfill a different role. They need data precision and data accuracy and whatever. And Kyle has a different problem and whatever. But from a shipper perspective, I would posit that you are running a very, very efficient supply chain if data quality is your primary issue. Because I think Kyle and people like Kyle have done a good enough job of solving the problem to solve just about all problems.
It's a prioritization issue too, right? Like not just in COVID, but right now, right? Like, you don't get to treat every single container you're moving as priority number one, right? You have to make prioritization decisions, and it may be better to incur demurrage on one container because it's more optimal to pick up another container that's yet to go into demurrage, right? For whatever downstream reason, right? So, Kyle, take us home.
I'm just excited that more structured data is coming to the space, because I think there's a wave of next generation software solutions that are getting built and developed and coming to market faster than we might think. And they're all benefiting from more datafication, more technology investment across all the nodes in the logistics network. So all those things we've been waiting for since the 80s, I feel like they're actually starting to arrive.
Well, yeah, catch the second part of this when it's just 4 large language models having this conversation.
Exactly.
Guys, thank you. This has been awesome. Grant, Jim, Kyle, awesome perspective. Thanks so much for including me. Always a pleasure to be involved in these discussions. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Great questions. I assume all the VIZION team will follow up with anybody who didn't get their question answered. But thank you everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Everybody.
Take care. Thank you very much for including me.